Not all illusions are created equal. East of Eden's Affirmation of Goodness. From the Book of Genesis to Milton's Paradise Lost to Nietzsche's On the Genealogy of Morals, the complexity of human motive has provoked a millennia-long lineage of question and answer, despair and triumph. In 1952, John Steinbeck's biblical saga East of Eden graced this ancient, yet ever-new tradition. The novel dramatizes how variously men desire and perceive the good, such perceptions then disparately driving their actions. Character Adam Trask struggles to accept the existence of evil. From his dogged belief in integrity, he projects goodness even onto a woman who attempts to abort his children before shooting him in the shoulder and leaving him with newborn twins. Contrastingly, the wicked Kathy fails to appreciate goodness at all. Convinced of humanity's unadulterated weakness, Kathy calls Adam a fool for his blindness to vice. In like sentiment, critic David McCreight celebrates Adam's eventual disillusionment as a deliverance. And yet, after recognizing Kathy's truly evil nature, Adam responds with an optimism alike to that which transfigured his world when he first fell in love with Kathy. His encounter with evil seems not to have dulled his sense of the world's goodness, not to have disenchanted him. Steinbeck's complex and often contradictory characters ultimately manifest Adam's illusion to be no illusion at all. Men's wisdom lies in his ability to discern that only goodness is immortal and powerful, while evil is but feeble and false. Steinbeck does not attempt to nail down why exactly individuals perceive the human condition so variously. In fact, his narrator explicitly wonders, why is it that some people are less affected and torn by the verities of life and death than others? Sage like Sam Hamilton likewise questions the differences he observes in his own brood. You'd think with the same training and the same blood they'd be alike, but they're not at all. In both major and minor, fictional and autobiographical characters, Steinbeck thematizes this mystery of personality, which transcends inheritance and conditioning. Alongside violent Charles Trask, Steinbeck sets up fictional protagonist Adam, who inexplicably resists recognizing, let alone indulging in evil. From youth, quote, something in him shrank from violence, from contention. Adam cannot believe that his father is a liar, despite overwhelming evidence of Cyrus's deception, and when he meets the injured Kathy, he falls immediately in love, blind to her intentions. Adam's aversion does indeed dull his rationality. It is, quote, a thought stultifying prejudice. To inflict any hurt on anything for any purpose became inimical to him. He became obsessed with this emotion until it blotted out any possible thinking in its area, unquote. His delusion influences even his physical senses. Quote, perhaps Adam did not see Kathy at all, so lighted was she by his eyes. She said she did not want to go to California, and he did not listen, end quote. Deriving from a Latin adjective meaning deafness, the word absurdity may thus appropriately describe Adam's reality-evading illusion. His naivete surpasses any that Kathy herself has yet encountered. She declares not only that she can do anything to him, but that in fact any woman can do anything to him, and she tells him, "You're a fool." And yet Steinbeck celebrates Adam's default need to find goodness in beauty. Despite himself recognizing Kathy's evil, Sam Hamilton discerns something more valuable than mere charm in Adam's innocence. He sees its danger and yet encourages Adam, "It's a lovely thing, preserve it and glory in it. Right now I can't recall any greater gift," unquote. This gift does not fade even after Adam encounters Kathy's true nature. After she shoots him and, changing her name to Kate, leaves to run a brothel in town, Adam is shocked and cannot understand her evil. But he eventually finds the world as rich and sweet as he had found it when he loved her. Under his illusion, quote, everything changed color, and the world opened out, and a day was good to awaken to, and there were no limits to anything, and the people of the world were good and handsome, and I was not afraid anymore, unquote. Later, Adam not only experiences Kathy's cruelty, but also hears her unabashedly revel in it, and yet the world still appears transfigured, glorious to him. Quote, Sam's funeral and the talk with Kate should have made Adam sad and bitter, but they did not. On his drive back to the ranch, Adam found that he was noticing things he had not seen for years, and he felt a quick pleasure, unquote. Steinbeck describes this kind of joy in the world as ecstasy that has nothing in the thoughts to justify or cause it. Adam himself acknowledges that faith in the world's goodness is exactly that, faith. As a young man, he believes his father's unlikely stories. His staunch trust infuriates his brother Charles. But Adam asserts simply that conviction trumps data. Quote, "The proofs that God does not exist are very strong, but in lots of people they are not as strong as the feeling that he does." Remarkably, Adam Trask professes the same creed as does C.S. Lewis's Puddleglum in The Silver Chair, published only 1 year after East of Eden. The evil enchantress of a dismal underland attempts to bewitch Puddleglum and his companions into believing that Narnia and its godlike Aslan and its sun and stars are but fiction, to which Puddleglum responds, "Suppose we have only dreamed or made up all those things. Then all I can say is that, in that case, the made-up things seem a good deal more important than the real ones. We're just babies making up a game if you're right, but 4 babies playing a game can make a play world which licks your real world hollow. That's why I'm going to stand by the play world. I'm on Aslan's side, even if there isn't any Aslan to lead it." Like Lewis, Steinbeck writes at the close of one of the darkest periods in global memory. Upon accepting 1962's Nobel Prize in Literature, Steinbeck declares, "Humanity has been passing through a gray and desolate time of confusion." But like Puddleglum, Steinbeck calls necessary an unflagging and even seemingly unwarranted belief in man's capacity for virtue. In East of Eden's protagonist, Steinbeck plays out the astounding strength of such trust. It fortifies Adam against Kathy's attempts to disprove human goodness. She claims that, quote, "in the whole world there's only evil and folly," unquote. And as evidence, she spreads before Adam 100 photographs of her brother's patrons, captured naked in pathetic, brutish postures. And yet Adam is unconvinced, declaring, "Nonsense, this isn't true, and it wouldn't matter even if it were true." To him, it is as if man's virtue so far outweighs his vice that to expect only the latter is to wait upon an illusion, a non-entity. Adam's conviction of integrity does not, however, utterly deny the existence of evil. Unlike Kathy, he merely looks past particular vices towards some more underlying, lasting principle of goodness. He, quote, "looked at generalities and did not inspect details," unquote. Kathy commits the philosophic fallacy that one can discern the nature of a thing merely by summing up observed instantiations of it. Having found her parents to be fools and men to be lustful and weak, she tabulates these experiences and concludes that such weakness essentially constitutes humanity, and her envelope of photographs physically represents her mental equation. But in Aristotelian terms, Adam's seemingly myopic inattention to particularities would more accurately assess nature than do Kathy's calculations. In his Politics, Aristotle declares that one must study man not, quote, "in specimens that are defective, but must philosophically contemplate a man that is in the best possible condition to find the principles that govern his nature." Sam Hamilton echoes this strategy, basing his belief in human greatness on the highest and best members of the race, even if they are far outnumbered by, quote, "the weak and quarrelsome," and even if such exemplars exist only in fable. Sam will look to, quote, "a dozen men who were not destroyed amidst the tens of billions who have trod the earth, for, quote, they are the ones the world lives by." If men were only evil, he declares, we would, millenniums ago, have disappeared from the face of the earth. With no scientific basis, Sam is in fact asserting a sort of ontological proof of human greatness. Because Sam can conceive of some moral axis towards which man asymptotically strives, though he fails to reach it forever and again, this axis must exist, for if it does not, Sam's idea of greatness would outweigh the reality in which his own brain exists, a logical contradiction. Clinging to this possibility of good, Adam can engage with evil ever optimistically. When his Chinese servant Li praises the strength of a loving woman, Adam grimaces, but he does not let his negative experience with Kathy sour his vision of potential feminine virtue, declaring, "How could I know out of one experience?" Not ignoring the complexity of human action, Adam is able to, quote, remember some tea that tasted bitter, without despairing of tea's sweetness entirely. Lee's native Chinese drink symbolizes the ultimate sweetness of a condition fraught with corruption. The drink, quote, tastes of good rotten apples. Likewise, Sam discerns value beneath and belied by all physical sense and experience. His horse, Doxology, is ugly, sick, and intractable, and yet somehow, quote, I love him. And of his useless property, Sam declares, quote, somewhere in my dust heap there's a richness. Doxology, referring to a hymn of divine praise, is a most interesting choice of name. Doxa derives from the Greek verb meaning to accept or to believe, but it also, oddly, means glory. While Adam, Sam, and Lee especially profess and live out this etymological marriage between faith and glory, Steinbeck emphasizes that through recognizing their own free will, all men affirm their capacity for glory. In fact, he beautifully illustrates that even man's natural functions serve as a kind of doxology, gratuitously drawing goodness and order out of experience. Quote, in their millions, the frog songs seem to have a beat and a cadence, and perhaps it is the ear's function to do this, just as it is the eye's business to make the stars twinkle. End quote. Steinbeck juxtaposes the glory of Adam's childlike faith with Kathy's miserable disbelief. Just as Adam inexplicably tends toward goodness, Kathy is, quote, born with tendencies toward evil. Attempting to understand how she could be so cruel, Adam tells Kathy, quote, you hate the good in others you can't get at. Kathy claims that her conniving cruelty is a superiority, a strength, declaring, nobody can trap me. And yet she cannot help but recognize in herself some vitiating lack. Kathy resents not only others' capacity for goodness, but also, and more importantly, their capacity to see goodness, even where it is not immediately present. That is, she covets the faith she claims is folly. She calls her parents, Adam, and others fools for trusting her, for mistakenly loving her and believing her to be good. But it is precisely this belief that she herself cannot access. Quote, only one thing bothered her. Adam had a warmth toward her which she did not understand, since she had none toward him, nor had ever experienced it toward anyone. Adam encounters Kathy and leaves jubilantly exclaiming, I'm free. In contrast, Kathy's insecurity grows. She knows that her actions are unconscionable and is, quote, almost glad when she learns that the pain in her hands was developing arthritis. An evil voice had whispered that it might be a punishment. End quote. Her son Cal declares her to hate bright light not because it hurts her eyes, but because she's afraid. She avoids the sun, as does Milton's Satan. In despair, Satan apostrophizes the sun, quote, to tell thee how I hate thy beams, which remind him of a glory to which he is no longer privy. Confidence in man's glory is what, quote, relates us to the world. In contrast, Kathy's incapacity for goodness isolates her, quote, herself was an island. By hating that which she actually desires, Kathy perversely begins even to love the evil she claims to detest. Of her brothel's pathetic patrons, she declares, I love to rub their noses in their own nastiness, and she calls her photographs of them beautiful. St. Paul's epistle to the Romans similarly describes the disordered, self-defeating phenomenon that is sin. It makes man indulge in that which he knows he hates. Disguised as freedom, Kathy's evil entraps her, and her arthritic fingers curl in upon themselves, physically manifesting her gradual inner contortion. Kathy walls herself up in her lean-to, forever fearing, quote, the something which had begun to crouch outside the house. Fascinatingly, Kathy conceives of this danger in the same terms by which God warns Cain of lurking evil in the book of Genesis. Quote, sin is crouching at your door. Adam, Sam, and Lee pore over this scriptural passage, celebrating man's freedom to resist the crouching evil, to rule over it, as God says. But Kathy fails to appreciate such power and commits the ultimate divorce from reality through suicide. Man, made in God's image, deviates from divinity through sin. But in a fascinating reversal, Kathy's sons, externally images of her, do not resemble her internally and deviate from her trajectory through goodness, not evil. Kathy's actions have no hold on her sons. Her evil affects its own extinction and leaves, quote, no imprint. Steinbeck affirms, on the other hand, that goodness and virtue are eternal, passed down, inherited, whereas evil occurs merely as breaks along the continuum, snags, quote, in the fabric of the human condition. Both, quote, virtue and vice were warp and woof of our first consciousness, but evil must constantly respawn, while good, while virtue is immortal, is venerable as nothing else in the world is. Critic Barbara Heelan notes that just as God's blessing of Cain in Genesis accompanies Cain's heirs, so also the goodness of ancestors implants itself in the minds and hearts of descendants. Lee declares that both he and Adam must have a piece of Sam Hamilton in them. Sam's goodness is immortalized in them. In contrast, evil fails to cling similarly, and leaving his mother, Cal rejoices that he need not have her in him. Quote, if I'm mean, it's my own mean. Thus, goodness does not operate the way that churches and whorehouses do, according to Steinbeck. The latter two serve as distractions, quote, to take a man out of his bleakness for a time. On the other hand, goodness lingers in and constitutes the world. Steinbeck speaks of a corrupt creature who, quote, went to jail, but no one ever arrested the good things he had released. It doesn't matter much that his motive was impure. He used good material, and some of it stuck. Hence, the good is no mere alternate to or reprieve from evil, but rather, quote, an anthem recognizable and lasting. Evil's limited reach lies in its self-centeredness, whereas the power of goodness lies in its other-centeredness. From her particular brand of illusion, Kathy expects only evil and selfishness and is thus fatally confused when she encounters love. But Adam's engagement with evil only further bridges him to others. He recognizes the need to see his sons as people. His natural urge toward goodness has always inclined him to take on, quote, another's pain for him, the way at other times he might have done his homework, unquote. And his initial delight in Kathy stems from his gorgeous desire to have someone to whom, quote, to show a garden. Adam combats unhappiness in others. As a youth, he bestowed anonymous gifts upon his stepmother, and then later he gently straightens out Kathy's warped hands, curled like a nest. Cal inherits Adam's capacity for goodness, which likewise turns him outwards. He appoints himself, quote, guardian of his father's content. This urge toward another's happiness beautifully reverses Cain's selfish refusal in Genesis to act as his brother's keeper. In an autobiographical turn, Steinbeck relates the blessed contagion of his Aunt Dessie's happiness and goodwill. After a visit with Dessie, quote, the supper would be delicious, omelets never fell, and cakes rose to the balloons of lightness. Like a cup that floweth over, Sam Hamilton's goodness infects his acquaintances such that he remarkably, quote, made a man better than he was before. Lee even proposes that simply believing in the good can actualize it in the world. He says, pretend it's true, and maybe it will be. Throughout his novel's 600 pages, Steinbeck presents the desperately complicated dynamism between good and evil, definitively to affirm with Lee the ultimate triumph of the former. At the end, there's light. In his Journal of a Novel, Steinbeck explains that the very title, East of Eden, attests to the goodness of man's earthly condition. Quote, although East of Eden is not Eden, it is not insuperably far away, end quote. Thus, confidence in goodness is no illusion from which man ought to be delivered. Amidst sadness and death, such confidence transcends mere rational justification, requiring an act of the will. Adam, remembering his brother's visage of destruction, shakes, quote, his head to rid his memory of the vision, and tries to rebuild the face, smiling, end quote. His rebuilding, transfiguring faith acts enzymatically, generating sweetness, quote, a ferment of happiness. But Kathy's blindness to the good reveals her to be the true fool, clinging to an existence not worth living at all. Thank you.